All right there, welcome everybody. It's Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. Time for Drawing Together. I'm Scott Maier, here with Artists Network, so we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern to draw together. So welcome everybody. I made a few changes to the setup here, so if you notice any technical issues, please let me know. One of the things I'm a little worried about is the audio syncing. I had a little trouble working that out, so if it's not synced, somebody could let me know. It should be pretty close. But with these live events, it's always fun. So thank you everybody for joining me. I'm really looking forward to this episode, drawing this giraffe. So a quick note before we get started, if you're new, this show is all about us getting together to draw once a week, kind of taking some time out of our busy lives to kind of improve our practice here. If you have any questions, observations, thoughts, concerns, use the chat to let us know. We'd love to help answer any questions you might have. We also want to hear about your approach to drawing. So what I'm going to demonstrate here is simply how I navigate a drawing and some of the things that I'm looking for. We choose a new subject each week designed to help us move forward. So we're trying to find something in this subject that can help us really, kind of improve and advance our practice, and maybe even if we're going to apply it to our watercolor paintings, pastels, oil paintings, whatever. So drawing is just a great thing to do. It's also a great way for us to kind of, again, take some time out of our busy lives and bring ourselves into focus. I need this time at least once a week to kind of ground myself. So if you like the show, be sure to like and subscribe it. Bring all your friends. We'd love to grow this community as much as possible. So let's get to it. Oh, final thing, if you want to follow along, you can find the link to the photo reference in the description below, where you'll also find a link to the show page where you can share your work when you're done. So feel free to post it. I love seeing all of your work, especially, all the ones that you guys are really great at being vulnerable and talking about some of the things you might be happy with or less happy with, but just putting it out there that this is all about practice. It's not necessarily about showing off the kind of perfection, although we love to see those drawings when you really nail it. But also kind of being open about the challenges that we all face. There's a lot of drawing, there's a lot of art that we make that sometimes just doesn't work out, but it's really critical and valuable for us to grow. So. All right, let's get to it. We're here to draw. This is the subject today. We have this awesome looking giraffe in charcoal. Feel free to work in graphite if you'd like as well. Thank you for sharing the bit.ly link to the reference image, so I appreciate that. Excellent. Yeah, I'm hoping that the video is a little bit clearer than we have had. We're on episode 130. You'd think I would have figured this out long ago, but there's so many ways to make this better. So I'm trying to continually improve. Now, I chose this giraffe because he simply looked fun. I haven't drawn one before, but I'm going to try to use what I know about other drawing practices to apply to the subject. Now, my approach to this is, when I think about drawing is ultimately about the decisions. It's not necessarily about the subject. So I'm not going to draw this giraffe fundamentally differently than any other subject. We're going to make the same types of decisions, and this is going to challenge us because of the unique form, the unique structure and textures here. The light, it plays a role in this, but it's not the key factor for me. It's really all about edges, I think, in this one. Just really beautiful and sensitive curves and that texture as we move from some of the harder, finer fur on the head, the shorter fur there, to then some of the longer ones along the mane or on the top of the, whatever it is on top of his head. So, but the light does play a role here, and I want to kind of talk a bit about that. When selecting a photo to work from, one of the things I look for is a strong sense of light and shadow. If I had taken a photo without a distinct light side and shadow side, it can be a great photo and it might be really attractive to look at. But when it gets into the drawing of that photo, sometimes there's not as much to really sink your teeth into. So that light and shadow helps you to see that form, and it gives you stronger contrast between light and dark to create a stronger composition. So that's what kind of drew me to this, is that it's an okay pose. There's nothing dramatic about it. But it's really the fact that it has a strong light side and shadow side that said this is going to work as a subject because I have that light and shadow that shows off the form and the texture in a way that will help me to understand that the structure of the giraffe better. So hopefully that makes sense. All right, so welcome everybody. I love seeing where you're all viewing from. If you're new, tell us where you're viewing from. I'm going to go over the materials I'm using. Let's see, I lost my vine charcoal. Oh, here it is. I put it over here. All right, vine charcoal, just a small stick of this. I have 2 sticks of the compressed charcoal. These are the Primo charcoals here. I have a B and an HB, so nothing super dark. I might pull out my 3B a little bit darker if I need it, but I think I can get away with it with just a kind of a hard and a medium size charcoal pencil here. You know, my pencil is starting to wear down, so I have this extender. I like to hold the pencil as far back as I can. It allows me to control the touch a little bit better. I have a blending stump as well as I've been using the same paper towel for quite a few drawings, so I'll be using that to wipe things down. Put that here, and then finally my erasers. I've been using these tools for quite a while, and it's probably time for me to experiment with something new, but I just keep coming to what I love here. I love this Derwent retractable eraser that I have carved down to this chisel tip, so that sharp edge is going to really help with that texture. And then, of course, I have my kneaded eraser. So if you do have any questions, comments, different tools that you're using, we'd love to hear all about that. I'm not seeing any questions in here, so I'm just going to get to it. If you do have a question for me and I miss it, please type that out again. Sometimes it just gets lost in the chat. So I just want to make sure I do my best to answer all the questions as thoroughly as I can. Or if I say something and it makes absolutely no sense, call me out on it so I can clarify it. Sometimes I start drawing and I'm not thinking as clearly as I could be. So, all right. In the paper, this is the Somerset rag that I'm using. This is provided by Legion Paper. So this is 100% cotton rag paper. It's a little bit lighter weight. I often use the Rives BFK. That works out really well. But I chose the Somerset today. It's just a little bit smoother of a surface for this. And I used the Rives BFK for this test one. It holds the charcoal a little bit more, so we'll see. I kind of experiment, and I kind of like the drawing process when I'm simply reacting to the paper, and kind of changing up that surface can really be a great way to unlock some new techniques and processes. So Nell Art is saying, I've been reading about focal point. How do you set up a subject for composition? What do you think about it? That's a really good question. So composition is important. Some of the things that I look for is the abstraction of the subject, and that's really hard. It was really hard for me to even do that, and I still have a hard time. Like, it's just something I'm continually working on, is seeing the subject as an abstraction, and I'm going to try to demonstrate that as I get started here. Actually, I'm going to adjust the exposure here, make that a little bit darker. So when I'm thinking about the abstraction, I'm thinking about really the shapes of light and dark, and building the composition around that arrangement of light and dark. Sometimes when you have a subject that is kind of dynamic and attractive, it's so easy to make a subject-driven composition, meaning that it's, the first thing you're reacting to when you're seeing that, you're seeing the work is the subject itself, not necessarily that subconscious feeling that everything feels put together and dynamic, right? So as I'm looking at this, I'm trying to think about just shapes of light and dark. And then when I'm thinking about composition, there are a few things I'll be looking at. I'll be looking at positive space, so this dark shape, and then the negative space, the space around it. I also think about how the composition engages the side edges of the paper. All 4 sides, not just the top and the sides. Often we orient ourselves to the paper as though it's a landscape with not really considering the bottom. So this has been a big focus to me, is what happens, how do you exit the bottom here? Diagonals tend to make a more kind of dynamic feeling in the work, in the kind of the abstraction of the composition. Diagonals have a lot of power. Horizontals tend to be more stable and calming, and so you're going to find a balance between all of those things. And I feel like really the best way to get better at composition is to experiment and do a lot of drawing. And quick thumbnails will get you there. When you're thinking about composition, often the fine details and refinement play a much lower role in ultimately what makes a strong composition. Having said that, where you bring your subject into refinement will affect the composition as well. So I'll be selective here and really finishing or refining only certain areas so that I can bring the viewer's eye into that. But when you take the entire composition in as a whole, that's really a critical thing. And often we weight the role of detail or refinement with regards to that composition. So just to kind of put that out there, so because if you are practicing, quick thumbnails will actually go a long way in helping you kind of unlock new compositional structures that can really move your designs forward. So hopefully that gives you something to think about. It's such a complex subject with so many things to think about. And this, in terms of the focal point, I think with the giraffe, the head and the eyes in particular make sense to make as a focal point, especially the way we have this strong diagonal leading up to it. We have these verticals here that kind of frame that as well. We've got the ears leading into it. So just the natural structure of the giraffe is doing something to really reinforce the face as the focal point. Yeah, sunflower cherry, flower 12. Can you use tissue to smooth the drawing of the giraffe? Yes. I just use whatever paper towel I have. I've heard a lot of good things. A lot of pastel artists and watercolor artists that I know use Viva paper towels because they don't shed quite as much as some other paper towels. But I don't really worry about that too much. But something to think about with whatever material you're using to smudge, that it can kind of leave some lint on the surface. All right, so I've just got a real quick arrangement of shapes. What I'm thinking about here is just simply getting something on the page. I'm not thinking about accuracy. I'm not thinking about drawing a giraffe. I just want to get marks on the page, because with this, now I start to have something that I can react to, and I can make specific decisions about how I want to affect the composition, the proportions, etc., the light and shadow, all of that. You can see I'm making the decision here to merge the shape here of light with the blue sky and the light on the giraffe, and then merge the dark areas as one as much as possible. I'm trying to think about an overall shadow shape rather than dividing the composition in the subject linearly by kind of outlining the form and creating those divisions with outlines. And I do this because I just learned over the years that when I start with a linear drawing, it's then harder for me to unify the drawing. You're starting from a point of division, mapping out the placement of everything, and then filling that in. And when I approach it that way, I just had a hard time bringing all those different segments together. So I had to flip it to be thinking really about it as shapes of light and shadow, and then moving into division. And that's really just how I work. I know a lot of you may start and prefer to start by kind of mapping the form using contour lines and then building in your light and shadow. And that's totally fine. It's just kind of a different approach. And it might be worth it. It's probably be good for me to go back to that, try a linear approach every now and then. But it can be helpful, again, just to kind of shake it up. All right, so with the, with the giraffe, starting to kind of, it's starting to trigger something in my brain right now, just this muddy shape of it being a giraffe. I'm going to look at the composition. I'm seeing differences between its overall placement and the reference photo. And I have to ask myself, how critical is it that I make this really match the photo? And I may decide that I really need it to match, or maybe I'm just using the photo as a jumping off point. And that's something that it's helpful to really determine early on in the drawing process, so that you're conscious of that as you're making your decisions. When I make that decision later on, what happens is I'll initiate the drawing with one kind of target in mind and then change that. And then they end up in this weird no man's land where the drawing isn't really good at either approach. So for example, I'm looking at the giraffe is placed a little bit higher on the page. If I look at this space here, it's a little bit shorter than what I'm seeing in the reference photo. And it's a little bit higher here as well. It's like I'm lifting the giraffe up. And as I'm thinking about that compositionally, I kind of like that. There's something that I'm reacting to. It kind of accentuates that diagonal lift and the length of the neck. And I think I'm actually going to go for that rather than, again, match the composition there. If you do want it to match, what you would want to do is you want to take this measurement here on the reference photo, compare it to the height of the head, and then also compare it to this negative space below, and then adjust the proportions there. Stephanie Ashworth, this says, love the dark like ending on ear that shows the ears are sharply tipped toward the picture plane. Yes, this light shape here. And what you're also talking about too in general, that alternating sequence of light to dark, to light to dark, to light, and then actually I need to darken the sky here a little bit. That interplay is really a helpful thing to be aware of when you're composing your composition, so you're composing your drawing. So, all right, so I'm just going to wipe this down. I'm going to stick with the gesture a little bit more, so I'm going to actually just do a bunch of these. Every time I do, I'm just going to become a little bit more familiar with the subject, with the composition and the proportions, and I'm going to make very quick decisions. Again, and I'm trying to think about it abstractly. I'm letting my eyes blur. I'm not really squinting. I'm just letting them lose focus. I'm relaxing them so everything is blurry right now, and that helps to kind of disengage the mind a little bit so we're not getting sucked into the details and really identifying it as a giraffe. It helps to activate that part of the brain that can see it as an abstraction. And that's where I'm trying to get, there's so much of the drawing process which is about kind of overriding natural processes of the brain. So I'm going to do another quick study, bringing in a little bit more of a linear approach, thinking about kind of mapping the contour of these shapes. And it kind of brings to mind one of the things that we've talked about in the past is, we talked about it with the Sargent copy, about the idea of having an anatomical understanding of your subject can be really helpful. It brings a depth of awareness to your drawing. At the same time, I try not to get too concerned about really understanding the anatomical structure of, say, a giraffe like this. Because you can always rely on just simple drawing decisions, right? We're making drawing decisions. We're not making giraffe decisions, right? And we'd apply that same thinking, the same strategy to any subject, and it can really unlock so much of your kind of artistic practice and your creativity. I know for me, when I would first start out, I'd be thinking about, well, how do you draw a giraffe? How do you draw an apple? How do you draw a landscape? As though you would fundamentally do those differently. But as I've kind of embraced drawing more, I realized that it really has nothing to do with the subject. It has everything to do with our relationship to the materials and the subject. It's the decisions we make as we navigate. How do we deconstruct the subject in front of us through the drawing process? And that is ultimately what drawing has as its power, or offers as its power. So, and by thinking that way, it allows me to kind of continually be surprised and curious about the subjects, right? And there's always part of me that, when I'm drawing, tries to keep alive that past me that had never drawn before and is simply discovering materials. You can never get rid of that completely, but it was so exciting when you're just learning how materials work. It's a little frustrating too, but also exciting. And then Nell Art, should we draw at the same time with you, or is it better if we just pay attention and then draw? That is totally up to you. I know some of you are drawing along directly with me, and some of you prefer to kind of absorb it and then watch back later. This does go up as a recording right afterwards, and so so don't worry about that. You'll always be able to go back and look at it if you need it. And I think part of that is just really kind of identifying your learning style. I think if it were me kind of flipping the script a little bit, I would probably just watch at this point and try to take it all in as kind of just an overall mindset rather than a specific set of instructions on how to complete this drawing. So the idea is that even if you had a different subject, we could still be kind of comparing our drawing process or our thoughts about drawing. So again, I'm choosing to spend a little bit more time really playing with the gesture, and part of that is to help warm up and kind of connect myself to the materials a little bit more. I'm a little disengaged from the drawing, and so I need to bring myself into focus a little bit. And I'm not necessarily ready mentally to make concrete decisions, so I'm delaying that a little bit. So I'm sorry if this is boring, if it looks like I'm doing the same thing over and over again, because I kind of am. But hopefully each pass that I make on this is giving me a little bit more information. So I'm using the side of the vine charcoal here just to lay stuff in. This vine charcoal is very fugitive. It's not going to last around a whole lot. So none of this stuff is going to be very permanent. Okay, so as I'm going to do this pass, I'm going to start to pay attention a little bit more to the relationship between the forms. So I'm starting to think about, generally the eye placement, looking for that axis, looking for the general relationship between the ear and the eye, that line of termination where we move from light side into shadow side, nose. And a lot of what's happening in this process at this stage is indirect observation. So I'm looking at the reference photo, but I'm putting my awareness on what's happening in the drawing next to it. So in the screen in front of me right here, I'm looking at what you're seeing. I'm seeing that overhead capture of the drawing as though it's vertically in front of me. And so out of my periphery, I can be watching the subject. I can be looking at the reference photo, but really be aware of what's forming on the page. And again, it kind of creates this feeling of being offset in my mind a little bit. It's almost like tracing. Imagine like you're literally tracing, but they're separate, which wouldn't be tracing, but having that mindset of tracing. So, all right. Who is that at Artist Network that's chiming in? Is that you, Jen? Sometimes it's just me here all by my lonesome. If you haven't gone into Artist Network, check that out if you're new, if you're just discovering this. Again, we meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern, but Artist Network has, we have a membership that gives you access to 800 videos, a lot of them, and as well as online events that we're doing monthly. All right. That ear is massive. Okay, so what I was talking about earlier, I'm putting information down on the page. It is, Jen. It's good to see you again. Now that I have the marks on the page, I can adjust them. I have something concrete to look at, and I can make very specific decisions about how I need to adjust the form. I can make it bigger, smaller, move it up, down, left, right, etc. If I try to resolve all of that in my head and then simply execute, it's really challenging. And the analogy that I use is that of putting together a jigsaw puzzle. So, it's a pretty rare person who can reach into a box of a jigsaw puzzle, pull out a piece, look at what's on the piece, and say, that goes exactly in the spot never to be moved again, right? And then you pick up another piece and say, oh, that goes over here, and they don't move, and the image just comes together because you know exactly the location of that information that you're seeing on each piece. Instead, the strategy that I use, and I know most people, you pour out a bunch of pieces, and as you gather information about what's on each piece, they move around until the image locks together. So what I'm doing here is I'm simply pouring pieces onto the page. Now I'm going to move them around. So as I gather information about the scale, the placement, and the relationship between all of these pieces, the image will come together. And that it takes time to really analyze that. And so the drawing becomes a record of my analysis of those proportions and the relationship between the forms. So I want to try to, I'm not afraid to allow some of that to show on. Let some of those old marks, some of these marks here can show up. That's just evidence that, that we've been thinking about this subject. That's what I love about looking at, say Leonardo's drawings, or say the Sargent drawing that we copied a few weeks ago. Seeing evidence of the thinking behind it and the adjusting on the page gets really exciting. It'd be like getting access to Bob Dylan's notebooks as he's writing a song, and you can see, he changed this word 3 or 4 times. He's making corrections as he's trying to think about how it all comes together, right? There's so much that you can really learn about the artist by seeing the mistakes that they've been correcting. So, okay, hello, okay. And Art is saying the rule of thirds applies to every drawing. It does not, in my opinion. Rule of thirds can be helpful. I've done plenty of works where I abandon that all, entirely, and I'll put a subject right smack in the middle. A lot of great work has been created that way. What the rule of thirds describes to me is something just natural in our attention, in that we tend to not fixate on the center of an object. We tend to be pulled a little bit adjacent to it. And I don't know exactly why that is. I'm sure a neuroscientist could tell us, but we tend to, what we found as we analyze compositions is that when we place a focal point in the thirds here, if we divide the structure into thirds, those intersection points tend to be natural places for our eyes to fall, and so if we put a focal point there, it feels very comfortable and it makes sense. When you look at somebody like going back to Sargent, for example, he'll push that. Sometimes you push that out to the edge, and it creates a little bit of tension that compels you to understand that subject even more. I think if there's a great painting that Sargent did on the Simplon Pass, when you see this big mountain and we see this mountain structure, and then you see this man kind of leading off the bottom. It is totally cropped in a very kind of photographic way. It's very advanced, but he totally broke the rule of thirds in that one, I think, if I remember it correctly. So I think it can be helpful, but it's also really exciting to see, like, what if you play with that a little bit and really respond to it, like, if you follow the rule of thirds, how do you connect with it in your own composition? And so I did a painting over the weekend where I tried to push points out from the edges. I like to push up to the edges more, either in the center or out to the edges rather than in the thirds. But again, that's just a personal preference. There's also the kind of the golden ratio that can play into it. Here's what I'm going to do. I talked about kind of mapping it out linearly. I'm going to do that here. So now that I have kind of I've got the ghostly outlines of this figure. I'm building up some tone there that'll serve me well. I can I can't erase. It's not coming up. I totally planned on this erasing, and it's not. Oh, well, all right. So what I'm going to have to do is go darker in those areas. That's fun. So what I'm going to do is, using my HB, I'm going to map out things kind of linearly. It's kind of slightly different than what I normally do. So a few things that I'm looking at here. I'm doing a lot of what's called angle sighting. If you're not familiar with that, what that means is that I'm putting my awareness on the angles that around the contour of the subject. The contour being really the edge of the subject, edge of the giraffe. And I'm looking at the angles. Right now, I'm just eyeballing it. I can see the reference photo, and I can see the drawing next to one another, and I'm just kind of moving back and forth, kind of guessing a little bit. And now I can become more specific by using this technique, closing one eye, so I flatten my depth perception. I'm aligning my pencil here with this edge of the ear, going to carry it over, locking my wrist. I'm going to compare it to the angle of the ear and then make some adjustments. So the way I think about it is that, my initial response is to go with my gut, and then I can kind of correct by using some of these sight measuring techniques. I can find the angle for the eyes and just kind of rough that in. And I find it really helpful to keep my eyes softly focused right now. And you can see that as I'm working through the angles of this, I'm moving back and forth. I'm trying to relate the marks here to the marks over here. Rather than working around the structure and ending up over here, I'm bouncing back and forth, and that's going to help with the symmetry or the near symmetry of this this pose. So Daniel is saying, the figure of the drawing comes easily. Light play is hard to do with pencil. It is a little bit harder with pencil, although now pencils really come in very dark values in a way that I don't remember being available when I was just getting started. Yeah, and so kind of adjusting your approach based on the medium can be helpful. And as I'm looking at the angles, I'm observing, there's complexity in this little tuft that I'm not going to address at this point. I'm going to be just kind of averaging out some of those curves into angles. And so when I'm looking at, say, this line here, as I'm following along this edge of that object, I'm kind of bouncing back and forth to this object. So when I talked about switching laterally across the form, you can also do that within the form. So as you're moving around the ear and you're thinking about, and you're kind of mapping this out, do a quick check-in here to see how these angles relate to one another across the form, how these lines relate to this, how this maybe relates to that. You're trying to make as many connections as possible across the drawing. And each one of those connections gives you another point of reference, another data set, essentially, to help you bring the subject to life. Now I can use the side of the charcoal to drop in some value here. And with the vine charcoal underneath it, it seasons the paper a little bit better. It accepts the compressed charcoal a little bit more easily than had I gone straight to the white paper. Okay, so now I'm trying to map out the bottom point of the head. And what you saw me do there is evaluating this overall angle, connecting kind of the bottom point here to the ears and observing that basic triangular shape. And I can connect across here. And I'm eyeballing it at first, but now I can compare the width from the tip of the ear to tip of the ear to the height of the head. And so I'm going to use actually a larger reference over here. I'm going to gauge that. Okay, so what I'm doing there is comparative measuring. So I'm closing one eye, I'm aligning this edge of the pencil with this part of the ear on the reference photo, sliding my fingers down until I get a measurement across So now this measures that distance from ear tip to ear tip, and then turning that vertically and comparing that to the height. If I align this point here with the base of the mouth there, how does that distance relate to this distance? And it looks like it's kind of in the ballpark. And that's all I'm concerned right now. I just want to get in the ballpark, not overthink it at this point. I'm going to get the rest of the drawing together, and then if I need to make some micro adjustments later, I can. Then question, please, from Rob. Scott, if you have time, could you explain what lost edges are and when to use them in the reference photo? I only see hard edges around the giraffe, I think. That's an awesome question. That is a big factor in what I feel compelled to explore in this subject are those edges. So the best way for me to conceive of them is to let my eyes lose focus. So right now, again, everything is loosely focused. I'm looking at the screen and it's all blurry. I'm looking at the reference photo and it's all blurry. If an edge disappears, when you do that, then that shows you that the contrast between them is lighter than it should be. So if I look over here on this side, when I squint or when I let my eyes lose focus, I can barely see that edge. And then ask yourself, can I see that edge or am I aware of that edge? Because those are two different things. Because sometimes we project something into the drawing that we don't optically see, but we know to be there. So for example, this side of the head, we know to be there. And this is something that I was kind of tripped up by in my preparatory drawing. I knew that edge to be there, but optically it's very subtle. It just fades away. When you squint at it, that edge almost completely disappears. And I look at the ear, that light side merges with that blue sky almost perfectly. It's a little bit brighter in here, but that edge almost gets lost. You do see a thin line around here, but this is something to kind of be aware of as you're connecting to the subject and you're just kind of feeling the edges. Sometimes you'll put a line in that doesn't exist. Sargent did this, going back to Sargent. He'd drop a line on a contour, and it'd be really hard and distinct, but he needed that to really define the structure. Sometimes you'll see an edge completely disappear, and that is needed to define the structure. And so I'll kind of talk through some of those decisions when I get to them here, but those are some of the things that I'll be looking for is really what information is being conveyed. If I'm looking at my drawing and I'm really not understanding it as a three-dimensional form, then maybe I'll enhance that contour line to really pull attention to it. So I hope that kind of gives some sort of foundation for where we'll be going with it. But that's a really good question, because I think that's such a key opportunity with this subject, is to explore those lost and found edges. And really what lost and found edges have the potential to do is describe atmosphere and light really, quite beautifully. One of the things that I look at here, as for example, is I'm looking at edges along here. It gets a little bit softer down in this edge because it's wrapping around kind of into the light, and there's a little bit of highlight here that merges with that blue sky, and it's hard to really see where that true edge is. So when we're looking at defining the edge through a contour line, that can become both an optical decision and simply an artistic decision. Ossicones, Stephanie, that's what they're called? That's awesome. Their head are made of bone and are part of the skull, not just for decoration. That's so cool. Thank you for explaining that. It's one of those things that I don't think I had ever considered until I started drawing the giraffe, is what those things are. So thank you for that. All right, so I'm just kind of blocking this in. I need to smooth this out a little bit. I'm going to use my palm because I'm lazy, even though this is in my hand over here. Okay, back to refining. I just wanted to kind of block in the shapes a little bit more. Eyes are still out of focus. Squinting, I don't think I can really overstate how valuable it can be to experiment with the ways you modulate your focus with your eyes. That's so much of the drawing process for me is, squinting, blurring my vision, opening my eyes so I'm flooding them with light, all while out of focus, and then bringing it into sharp focus and then pulling it back out. And it helps you to connect with the subject in a number of ways, and it can unlock some things about the form that you might miss if you kind of reduce your observations to a singular kind of modulation, the idea of only looking in sharp focus or only being through blurred vision. I'd say about 75% of this drawing is going to be completed with my eyes totally out of focus. And then I'm going to bring it into focus right towards the end, right when I need to refine things. And I can really start to kind of latch on to the finer forms of the subject and the finer lines. Next week, we'll be working on a Degas copy. And if you want to talk about contour lines, holy smokes, there's so much information that gets conveyed in a Degas drawing along that contour line, and we'll really dig into that. If we think about edges, I think I've probably learned the most about edges from looking at Degas' work. Ingres, I think, he studied Ingres for many years, and there's so much that you can see in Degas' work that comes from him. But, I just kind of throwing that out there. Okay. So now we're starting to kind of shift our attention to some of the smaller forms, and I'm not going to really think about eye, nose, ear. I'm just thinking about shapes. There's a larger shape, and then there's a smaller shape. And if I drop a plumb line down here, I can see how this point in this larger shape aligns with this smaller shape underneath. I can identify this darker shape in the shadow, and it's not perfectly horizontal laterally across there. There's a slight angle to it. There's a slight slope. There's a slight slope here. So again, that's how my mind is thinking right now. And then I'm observing a little bit. I know that this edge here, for example, it kind of folds into shadow. And so I can be a little bit heavier on this side here. And I've done no correcting of these forms yet. I haven't brought out the eraser. All right, did I get any, hopefully I got any other questions? Okay, so just thinking a little bit more, I'm looking at this, and I could measure it. I could take the width versus the height and compare the shape of the ear. But honestly, I think I'm just going to eyeball it. Sometimes, at least for me, I feel like over-measuring I can lose something in that. Sometimes it's in the mistakes, it's in the corrections, that reveal something about how we observe the subject. That's the beauty of drawing, is that it can help us improve our observations and then reveal certain biases or tendencies that we might have that can improve the next experience that we have. So, I like to allow just some natural observations to appear, because then that kind of reveals essentially my subconscious in a way, right? That how I'm thinking about it, how I'm reacting to it, how does it feel? For me, that might be different than you, rather than a 100% purely optical reproduction. There are some subtle differences, again, that kind of betray the subconscious reaction that each of us have to the subject. Again, I'm just thinking about shape and realizing what a complicated shape this thing is down here. And I'm a little nervous about it. When I get to refining that later, that's going to be a fun one. So I'm just going to be thinking about the overall form here, and noticing that like this edge becomes a little bit more visible. It gets lost here, a little bit lost here. There's this cool little slant that reveals kind of the character. Okay, so shadow shapes, light and shadow. Again, I kind of initiated the drawing by trying to observe the overall shadow shape. And what is that shadow shape? Well, it's a combination of the form shadow and the cast shadow. So this is primarily what we're looking at is the form shadow. So that means that's the shaded side of that form. We see a light side, shadow side. We see a transition between the two. That's called a line of termination. But we also see a bit of a cast shadow, and we see that here on the ear. So the crest of the head is casting a shadow here, and that's what's creating this sharp edge here inside that ear. And as was noted, I apologize, I can't remember who made that observation, but that helps to understand the three-dimensional structure of this ear, the way it might be projecting forward a little bit. You know, if we know that its point of contact is a little bit farther back on the head, but we see this in light, perhaps it's projecting a little bit forward. And over here, the light, it must be coming from behind the ear, placing this entirely in shadow. So we see a form shadow here, light side, cast shadow, but we see an entire shadow shape, which is the merging of those two. And the values in the form shadow and cast shadow are more similar to one another. So I'm going to identify that. Within that, we see some divisions. We see, you know, the cheekbone here. We see some of the folds along the neck. We go from head to neck, but I'm not going to over-render that division because I can't see it. And this is, again, the value of squinting or blurring your vision, is that it helps you to see the value relationships between these forms and that balance between unification of the form and then division. Where do we need to create more division, and where do we need to bring it together? That's so much of art and design, going back to the talk about composition. So much of what we're trying to solve in that is balancing variety and unity. So variety being the amount of change that happens in your composition, whether that's color, whether it's value, whether it's line, edges, all of that. Every time you make a mark, it's making some sort of division on the page. And then the more division you have, the more exciting it becomes, but there becomes also a point, if there's excess division, then it becomes difficult to interpret the subject, interpret what's happening on the surface here. And so that's where you then start to unify it a little bit more. You start to reduce the division, you reduce the contrast to help bring it back into a sense of cohesiveness and understanding. And you, as an artist, will have your own sensitivity to that balance, and that becomes part of your identity. You know, some of you will have a bias towards further division and stronger contrast, and some of you will have a bias towards reduced contrast and atmosphere and like just a kind of a softening. So that's kind of what I'm thinking here, and by bringing everything all up at once, I can be in control of that. I'm trying to start from a place of unity, and I feel like I'm hitting that point, you know, over the head, so I can stop now. But maybe there's somebody who's joining in for the first time, and if you are new, welcome. You can draw along with us. Reference image is in the description below. As I'm building up these values, I'm not being particularly sensitive. You know, there's some blotches happening. Using the side of the pencil. And as I'm going, I'm rotating the pencil, kind of rolling it in my fingers so that I continually kind of round out the pencil, and it gives me this super sharp point right here. And this is a harder graphite. I'm noticing it's kind of scraping away the surface a bit. I'm going to kind of refine just a little bit here. Sharpen that edge. All right, so now what do I need to do? Beth Weatherington, welcome. A newbie from Tampa. So welcome, Beth. Daniel saying you seem to get more precision from charcoal. Potentially. I kind of, charcoal and graphite, I kind of work similarly. And it part of that precision comes in the paper on the surface. And drawing, and we often overlook the importance of paper, but it's 50% of the equation. It's how the material, how the charcoal or the graphite or whatever you're using reacts to that surface that we're ultimately seeing. And sometimes it's easy to kind of forget that as a key factor. We'll just grab whatever paper, which is totally fine. But what I've observed in some people who are just kind of starting out is a tendency to, especially with charcoal, to kind of chastise themselves for making a mess on the page. And sometimes it's really the paper, right? And sometimes it's the materials. Sometimes it is you, but it's helpful to be aware that it's not all you, right? It's sometimes it is the paper. I think about when, say, learning an instrument, for example. If you're trying to make a nice, clear sound and you've got a cheapo instrument that's just not capable of making a clean sound, that's all you can do, right? So sometimes that's true with materials, and what works for me may not work for you. All right, what am I doing? I'm going to just kind of adjust these forms here. What I like to do is kind of think about adjusting the form from the inside out. So as I have the shape here, it needs to be a little bit wider, so I'm going to start from here, and I'm going to kind of pull that form over to the right until I find the correct width of this form. And again, I'm just eyeballing it right now. Hello. Is that Russian that I'm reading? Welcome. Unfortunately, I won't be able to answer any questions you might have, but if you do, I'll do my best. Okay, what do I want to do now? I'm asking myself here. Okay, I'm gonna go around the edges now and refine a little bit more. So what do I have? I got my retractable eraser. I can lift a little bit here, right? It's not all that light. So if I know that's really as light as I can go, I'm going to drop the value down in the background before I get any farther. So I'm just going to do a wash using the side of the pencil. I'm going to get some of that value contrast working for me. We're going to see this in the Degas drawing next week, his use of angular hatching like this in the background. And I'm using the weight of the charcoal. You see how far back I'm holding it here? So I'm just using the weight of the pencil. And I'm going to, again, create a value wash across here. And again, it's helpful to have a layer of that vine charcoal underneath. It just kind of, it accepts the compressed charcoal a little bit better. Nell Art has a question. Any advice for improving your drawing skills? Yes, I have lots of advice. Ultimately what it comes down to is practice, and you're going to hear that over and over again. But I think practice in kind of the right way can be helpful. Learn from as many people as you can. Draw regularly. One of the things that I really value that, I think I would have, when I was doing more teaching directly on ground with students, I think I undervalued, but I think it's more important to me now, is the value of teaching healthy habits, because it's out of those habits that you're really going to grow. You'll take drawing classes and you'll learn a lot of skills and you'll advance, but you're going to be doing this hopefully for the rest of your life, and you're going to continue to grow. 90% of your growth is going to come from your own motivation, something that you're choosing to practice and the things that you're aware of. And so really setting up a healthy practice can be a key to improving. And so what I mean by that is, think about what your motivation is to draw and when you're motivated to draw. What I struggled with early on was this kind of binge and purge mentality, where I'd be motivated to draw and I would draw for like 2 days straight. And then the next day would come and I was kind of exhausted and say, well, I just drew for 2 days. I don't think I need to draw today. And the next day it would happen. The next day it would happen. And then next thing you know, it's been 3 months since I've drawn, because I've been riding that satisfaction from that kind of binging process. And so what I recommend now for a lot of people is to make it your goal to build up that habit. So draw for an hour or two every day. And even if you're on a roll, cut yourself short. Say, I'm done for the day, because what's going to happen is you'll be thinking about that drawing all day long. You'll be thinking about it the next day, and you can't wait till your next drawing session. And then you do that again. You're on a roll, you're feeling good about it, and then you stop. And then you're basically building in moderation. And then what happens is, what you do is you gradually expand those daily drawing sessions until eventually you have this endurance when you can be drawing all the time. That's when you're going to really find the most benefit. And in that, you experiment with materials, make bad drawings, make good drawings, give yourself the target of if you can have one good drawing out of 100 when you're starting out, that's a good ratio, right? And then eventually it'll be, maybe one out of every 75 or one out of every 50 will be a drawing that you're really happy with. And you're going to gradually improve that ratio as you get comfortable with it. To me, again, I think that is where I feel like there's really the most benefit. And then within that, again, experiment, play around with different instructors, inspiration, find books, look at videos. Don't look at any of those things. Do master copies. You just throw whatever subject you can that you're guided by to get you drawing. Try a process that you're not comfortable with. And then every now and then go to something that you really are comfortable with to give yourself a win. The more comfortable you are with failure, the more growth you'll experience. So I think I've told this story before about being in art school and reaching this point where I wasn't enjoying it too much, because I was putting a lot of pressure on myself to try to be the best, in a school where everybody is just amazing, right? And I guess I just wanted to keep up. And in that desire to keep up was exhausting, and I didn't feel like I was really progressing anymore. I had lost that part of me that got excited by experimenting. So I asked my professor, I said, I'm just not loving it anymore. Can I make mistakes? Can I just make bad drawings? Is that okay? Do I have your permission to make bad drawings? And he said, yes, go ahead. And so I spent the rest of the semester trying new materials, making intentionally bad drawings. And out of that process, I unlocked a whole new set of techniques and mindsets about drawing that I was really grateful for. And so if you need that, I'm giving you all 100% permission to make as many bad drawings as you can. What was hard for me at that time is that I'd given myself the identity of making good drawings. I was a good drawer. And so what does that say about me if I'm making bad drawings, right? And so I had to get over that. I needed somebody to say, look, it doesn't make you a bad artist to make bad drawings or make bad artwork. So I hope that makes sense. All right, so Stephanie Ashworth, draw, 20 minutes a day. That's perfect, 20 minutes. Give yourself a time. Welcome, Bonnie. It's good to have you here. Again, if you are new and you're wondering what's going on, this is Drawing Together. My name's Scott Maier. We meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern, to draw together. We got a new subject each week to challenge ourselves so that we grow in particular ways, because this is all about growth as an artist, not demonstrating perfection, because I don't really know what that means. And then you can find a link in the description to the reference image, as well as the page on artistnetwork.com where you can share your work when you're done. So many of you I've gotten to meet offline, virtually. I haven't met anybody in person yet. So, all right. So, but it's a great community. I love it. We're on episode 130 already. 130 episodes. Still going strong. All right, so I'm just refining the forms. Now I'm working both additively and subtractively. So bringing out the eraser, I can use this to refine the form. Now, because I have this tone in the background, if I lay into the eraser too hard, it's gonna lift off more than I want. So I'm just starting with a really light touch to see what it can do to lift some of the value off of that background here, to refine that edge. Cleaning up some of the overlap in some of these areas. And I can use, as you can see, I'm using the side of the eraser to smudge and blend as well. Use my finger. I haven't used my blending stump yet, and I'll use that at some point. Heather999, I need that permission. You're awesome. Yes, I'm glad that it's helpful. I certainly needed that. Like I said, to me, the thing that is most powerful in drawing is the fact that it can reveal something really intimate about the person who created that drawing. There's such a direct connection between what's happening here and what we're observing in our world around us. It's being processed by our brain, and it's that electrical signal, that thought is being translated down our arms into our hands through the material onto the surface. And that's really direct. It's like a seismograph, right? We don't have that separation of even a brush, right? Or having to mix color and then apply it. There's something really direct about drawing that I think is really powerful. And to me, being able to see in a drawing evidence of that thinking that went into making that mark, that kind of the humanity of the marks, is what really is powerful. Now, look at this. I got the slope coming down this way. If I connect those two, I can't remember those terms. Was it Stephanie that you gave us the terms? I got to remember what those are. These little cool tufts. Let me adjust these a little bit. If I map out that slope, I should bring this up, and I can see some variations in the form that I need to make. A little bit darker on this right side, as we have a light and shadow effect coming in from this side towards the right. But it all depends on your relationship with drawing and with art making, and the reason that you're getting into it. I'm kind of describing my reason, but we all come to art and we have a different association with it. Some of you are storytellers. Some of you are you're using it as a form of kind of larger communications about our society. Some of you are really guided by simply expressing beauty. Some of you are going to be guided by your own personal connection to the art is just for you. Some of you, it's about observation and really kind of understanding the visual process, or understanding our visual system more. There's numerous ways kind of that we develop a foundation for why we paint and the role that art plays in our lives and the lives of the people we interact with. And I think our one of our goals as artists is to simply connect with that. So I'm not under any illusion that this drawing here is any form of storytelling. This is I guess the story that it's telling is simply of this experience, right? And that's all I want. That's what gets me excited. But it may not do it for you. All right, so when I'm going to adjust this, I want to shift this eye up just a little bit, doing some subtractive drawing, using the eraser. And I'm going to come over on this side. I'm going to adjust the shape of this ear. So as I'm doing this, I'm not just simply adjusting the shapes. I'm also thinking through edges, trying to identify where are the edges harder and softer. Where do I want to bring an edge into sharper focus? And where can I let it kind of diffuse? So right on here, there's light catching the top of that ear. So I'll use the eraser to bring that out. And to kind of get back to that question earlier about when would you enhance an edge and when would you let it kind of degrade? So as I can create an edge like this using the eraser, right? And if I wanted to draw more attention to it, pun intended there, I could bring a subtle contour line to sharpen that up, right? And then what I'd have to look at and analyze about that line is what is it doing to that edge? Is it flattening it? Is it creating more depth? Is there something exciting about the character of the line? Is there something abstract about it that I'm excited by? I think for me, it's a little too strong, so I'm going to get rid of that, but maybe sharpen that edge just a little bit by lightly bringing some of this background tone up to that edge. And kind of feathering it out into that background, right? So there's numerous ways that we can deal with that edge. I can smooth that out, bring it back again. You just kind of work that edge over and over again. Nia is saying, I tend to get caught up with needing my art to look perfect, and I'm constantly putting too much pressure on myself. It's nice to be able to relax and have fun doing art instead. Awesome. That's what I like to hear. Ossicones, thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, I'm going to forget that word. So thank you for reminding me. All right, so what I'm going to do here is one of the things that this approach, where you're kind of building everything up at once and gradually refining edges, one of the things about that approach that can be really interesting is to help you to become aware of really what's critical in an edge. So if you do feel like you're compelled to really over-define and over-sharpen the edges and it's not working for you, I mean, if it is working for you, don't worry about it. But if it's not, then consider, how much can you get away with? If you, again, going back to Sargent, since we did that copy before, if you really look at a Sargent work, there are so many areas in it that are actually kind of soft edges, but in a few key areas, bringing in a certain level of refinement and finish makes the entire painting or drawing feel like it's come together, right? So, and that's leveraging the viewer's mind, our natural tendency to complete whatever seems to be missing we fill in a lot of information with our minds. So, all right, so what I'm looking at here is I know there's going to be some variation in this shadow, but I'm just going to average it. I'm still using the harder graphite. I'm going to come back later with something that's a little bit darker to pull out some of those darker spots. So I'm not worried about some of those subtle areas yet. I'm just simply looking at these edges, kind of sharpening up as we go. I'm going to work on this eye a little bit. Actually, I'm not quite ready for the eye. I'm going to kind of work other parts of the head, develop the structure of the head. Stephanie, you made some good comments after that Sargent video that I think other people should take a look at. You'll see that in the comments below the Sargent video about the positioning of the model. So I wanted to thank you for those comments. So using the eraser here, kind of lifting off the light on this side, this is a great example of a lost edge in that reference photo. And again, kind of I'm trying to become aware of what do I know to be there and what can I actually see. And I'm going to start by drawing what I see, and then I'll enhance those edges if I feel like it's not really working. If I know that edge to be there, but it's not quite as visible, I'm going to shorten this ossicone. I got that word, I think. Unless it's pronounced like ossicones or something. But that'd be awesome if it was. All right. And I'm not necessarily worried about making those shapes 100% accurate compared to the reference photo, but this slope I think is important just in terms of the structure of the head. So I do want to make sure I convey that. All right, so now because I have the larger form really kind of established, I can be thinking more kind of finely. I can bring myself into focus a little bit more, and I can be working on these individual forms without fear of losing the overall structure and proportion. I don't have to be thinking across the drawing nearly as much. I think it is still important to kind of keep checking that. I'm going to drop a line there, but I'm not going to do that quite as much. I can really engage with these subtle forms a little bit more directly. But when I think about that, though, I'm still employing that same strategy, just on a smaller scale. So moving across the form, kind of starting on the ends and then building my way into the middle. Again, averaging the value, just trying to refine the shape before I go in and pull out some additional contrast in these forms. Greg is, I've seen this back and forth between Heather and Greg. Awesome. Again, I think that's what is so awesome about drawing is that you can understand the natural sensibility of each artist in there. Greg, you shared your latest drawing in that thread about this sailboat, and that was pretty awesome. So this form here, I kind of missed the mark on, so I can continue to refine that. Bring that out a little bit more. And again, so this is on an area where, again, that edge is really soft, but you know it to be there. If you want to call more attention to it, you can start to sneak up on defining it. So maybe just in one area, just kind of give it a little bit of a contour, maybe in another area as well. And so by this, we have this broken edge. And if it's not enough, you just keep adding to that edge until you found a comfortable balance for you. But it's really what's happening along that edge that creates the three-dimensional form. The more variation you have along that edge, the more depth is going to feel like you're creating there. Okay. Excellent. All right. I just want to continue to explore some of these forms. So as I get to this eye, I'm going to try to think about kind of working from the outside in, try to observe that structure. And this is where I can start to be thinking about the texture, the flow of the fur. And I'm not going to get in there and draw every little hair, right? And but I can pay attention to the direction, right? And try to suggest that. So if I look here at this stretch along the head, we see a change in direction of the fur from it being more horizontal here to then over here, wrapping up and around. And so I'm going to switch to this overhand grip and be thinking about the path and the direction of that fur. But I'm creating those lines using the side of the pencil, not the tip of the pencil. And I'm doing that just because it makes marks that feel a little bit more naturally formed, and it helps to create these scooping marks that have a soft landing and a soft liftoff. When I switch to this tripod grip and I'm really kind of scribing those lines, they tend to be kind of sharper in their ends, and they become more noticeable. And what it suggests to the viewer sometimes is that if that line is too strong, it suggests that that's actually the end of a form. If I draw a hard line in here, it gets confusing to the viewer because they're like, well, why is a form ending there? That's in the center of the forehead. And so with these overhand marks, you want to keep them subtle and really just convey the direction, the flow of the fur. And you can keep that mentality up as you move through other stretches of the head. And start to, again, you're not matching every little hair, you're just trying to convey that flow with those kind of scooping motions of the the pencil. Okay. Gina's saying, oh, this is a Derwent eraser. You have a question about it? This is a Derwent retractable eraser, and I simply use a razor blade to carve down to that sharp point. And then Mariana is saying, I would appreciate some advice on the steps to use to share my pick of work on the web page. So you have to be logged in. You don't have you just have to set up a profile on Artist Network to share. So when you're logged in and then you go to the show page, it should allow you to attach there. Sometimes if the image doesn't attach, sometimes it's because it's just too big. So if you keep the dimensions at around 1,200 pixels, that should be plenty big. If you do struggle with that though, you can. I believe my email is in the description below. I think you could just reach out to me and I can try to post it there. You can just attach it in an email. Okay, so back to this section. I kind of started wandering. I was working on the eye, but again, I'm so many times I'm still focusing on the eye, but I'm building up these other areas and kind of transitioning between them. So I'm working on this eye, working around the form, the structure of it. And if it helps, you might think about something delicate like the eye as by kind of building it by kind of connecting the dots in a way. I'm thinking about the form, but rather than draw a full line, I'm going to kind of just drop a little mark along that path and just kind of tap to help discover it. I see the eyeball here really cuts underneath. It's got such a strong curve to it. And then those eyelashes, holy smokes. It's pretty awesome. And now I'm going to move over here. I'll work my way across, kind of building up some of that tone through some of the cross-hatching. Thinking about, again, the flow of the fur. Maybe I'll bring this out to create some of that light. So the eraser marks, again, I'm just thinking about that flow. You get these cool eyebrows here. So what I have the larger image up here on my right. And as I'm making this eye, one of the things that's really easy to do is to get sucked into the whole, your whole head, your whole world becomes this eye, right? It's so easy to make that happen. But I got to keep pulling out and keep comparing it to other landmarks in the feature. So like this section right here, I can see where am I relative to that? Where am I relative to the other eye or other features of the head? And that'll help you with the scale of it. Because if you just, again, if you make your whole world about the eye now, it's easy to make it a little too small or a little too big. So keep kind of bringing yourself back out and thinking about it in the context of the whole, and then you can come back in and draw the shape of the eye. Keep double checking relative to other landmarks. And that is something that I'm guilty of so much, especially when working with portraits. It's so easy to get sucked into the world of somebody's facial features and then lose sight of the relationships between them. And it's this mental exercise that I have to keep beating myself over the head with to, and this is kind of the benefit of doing this live in front of you all. It helps keep me accountable to that. I feel like this eye could be a little bit larger. All right. I'm going to work my way down here. So you see this reflected light in here. How much I can just lift off some of the charcoal with just my finger. And before I do any more lifting, I'm going to kind of work my way through some of these kind of finer details in the shadow side here. And try to observe the structure. And as I'm observing these, there are these fine lines. I'm not drawing a line. I'm drawing kind of just these taps along there. And I'm trying to be aware of, again, the flow of the fur to help enhance that expression of the texture there. So then in here, there's some really nice, contrast there. Lift that up a little bit more. A really nice subtlety in those values. So especially with texture, my approach is to suggest more than describe as much as possible. So I'm making quick marks. It doesn't take long to fill in a space like this. And then right along in here, it gets really dark, right along that termination, but it's a soft transition there. So just be careful not to make too sharp of a line there. All right, thank you, everybody. Let's see. Drag and drop. I like that term, Mariana. Yeah, that's essentially just, you think about kind of really what's in my mind. We've talked about that before in some previous episodes, is when it comes down to it, if anything, just take some time to focus on shape and direction of your marks. What is the shape, and what direction do I need to make my marks? And sometimes that's just the gut feeling that you're connecting with, right? Because there can be so many decisions that we make when we're drawing, it can be overwhelming. And if you're new, trying to just focus on a few of those decisions at a time can be helpful. And then you add to it. As those decisions become second nature, then you add another one on there that starts to bog down your brain as you're trying to focus on it. And then eventually that will become second nature. And then you just keep expanding those decisions that are just going to happen very quickly as it becomes more automated in your subconscious. So if you're new though, like to drawing, and you're overwhelmed, try just thinking, what shape am I looking at? What's the shape? And what direction do I need to make my marks? Is it moving in this direction? Is it this direction? Is it vertical? And that can unlock a lot in your work. And from there, once you get the shape right and you got the direction right, then you start to see the subject on the page, and it helps to kind of unlock some things that might be evident in the proportions or the light and shadow. Because again, there's so many things to become aware of that if you do get overwhelmed, try to make it your goal to just focus on one or two of them. All right, so this is a cool stretch down in here. And so I'm reaching this point down here where we have a very complex form. We have the nostrils, we have the mouth. There's so many, like there's harder edges, there's softer edges. There's these fine furs, and some that are short, some that are long. So in order to tackle that, I'm going to use what I said earlier, that I'm just going to focus on drawing decisions, not anatomical decisions right now, because I don't have an anatomical understanding of this giraffe. If I were a biologist or something, if I studied animals, then perhaps I would be able to rely on that a little bit more. But instead, I'm going to just try to think of this form as an abstraction. What is the shape, and what direction do I need to make my marks based on the texture? What is the flow of the fur there? Kind of working from the center of the form out to the edges, and I'm seeing some lighter areas kind of mingling with some of the darker ones, but I'm not gonna lift the lighter shapes yet. I'm going to keep focusing on the dark side. And it's just such a complex form. We look down in here, and now we're looking back at the neck where it changes direction. We're seeing some reflected light down in here. I'm seeing a harder edge that represents kind of wrapping around that form there. And you can see I've left this unfinished at this point because I don't really know what I'm going to do there yet. All right, thank you, everybody. If I've missed any questions. Oh, nail art. If you take art on a professional level, how do you start? How do you start to become a professional? That's a big question. Let me see. I think getting a mentor could be really helpful. Find people who are already doing it, and see what they're up to. Ask them. The more curious you are, I think asking that question is really helpful. That's a great way to get started. And then you might take the words that I have, and it might click something for you, or you might just say, "This guy has no idea what he's talking about." And that's totally cool, because the truth is I sell some of my work, but that's not a focus for me. And it's been something that I have contemplated for 25 years now, since graduating art school, or since going to art school. What do I want? And when I went to art school, my goal wasn't to become a professional artist. My goal was to simply paint and draw, because that's just what I wanted to do. I was 18, and I'm like, I just need to pursue this because I'm excited. And I didn't have that long-term thinking kind of available to me. And then as you've gotten older, you get a family, and there's all sorts of things that factor into it. I've had to contemplate, really, what do I want out of this? And my goal has always been, how do I figure out how to continue to paint and draw? I've never really created work for other people, so that wasn't my goal. And so, if you really enjoy that part of sharing your work with other people, and it becomes a dialogue between you and the viewer. Whether you're doing commission work or you're more kind of personal in your own work, then my advice is to start showing it to as many people as possible and get that feedback, and just observe, how are people reacting to it? What are they responding to? And let that inform your work. And then the sooner you can start that dialogue, the easier it'll be to form and build a brand around your work that, where you're providing that. It's that exchange that works. And then make sure that you kind of tap into what it is about the art making process that is bringing you satisfaction, so that you build that into your business plan so you don't lose that, right? I never really pursued commercial art just because it was just really hard. It's a hard thing to do graphic design, to illustration. And I didn't quite have the mentality that could take that kind of feedback from a client and do the work that I know a client would want. I kept projecting my own personal stuff into that, and I wasn't very good at it. I know some people who are tremendous illustrators and then find their way into creating their personal work, through that path. So there's so many ways to go about doing it. I've embracing teaching more, and then I prefer that be how I make my living, and working on that side of the equation. But eventually, at some point, I may try to sell more. So I think kind of gaining some clarity there can be helpful in driving you to the people that can give you the resources. Hopefully that makes sense. But I think, having mentors asking questions is really an effective way at helping you to kind of develop a business plan. I just know for me that drawing has always been something that's been relatively personal. I do it because I like what kind of mood it puts me in. And I do so many drawings that I don't really share with anybody else, and I would spend more time thinking about, well, how would I explain this to other people? And I think it's just, at some point I just realized, well, that's just what I want to do, is teach. And like I said, maybe I'll show some stuff every now and then and put myself out there, but I get less satisfaction from it than I know some people. That's everything about the work, is really getting that reaction and putting it out there. So. It'd be a good question to the group is what it means to you. So that was a very circuitous answer, I think. I hope I just didn't muddy the waters there. But I know when I started out, it was really, there's, the way forward was through essentially, let's say you're going into the commercial art field, the only way really forward was through galleries and getting into galleries, and they would help you with that. But those galleries still exist, but now we've also expanded to incorporate things like social media and so many other online tools. All right, so I'm going to, oh, thank you, Troy. I appreciate those comments. Oh, thank you, Nia. Yes, my book, if anybody's interested, I have a book. It's called See, Think, Draw. It's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can pre-order now, but it won't be available for print until like June. So, oh, Mariana saying, I use the phone camera, take a picture of my drawing, then think, ugh, and then I see a lot, oh, I want to change. Thank you for bringing that up. I've totally forgotten about the need or the importance of changing your context, your relationship to the drawing. So what do I mean by that? We get locked into a particular point of view. When our relationship to our work stays consistent, it's going to naturally distort. Right? Our brain is meant for images to constantly change. The best way to reveal something that needs to change in your work is to change your relationship to that. So you can set it up at a distance, flip it upside down, hold it in a mirror, take a photo of it, look at it as a small thumbnail. Every time you do that, it's going to reveal something about the nature of the work that you couldn't see in another way. So letting your eyes lose focus, bringing somebody else that you can trust to give you a proper observation and feedback can be a great way to do that as well. So seeing it through somebody else's eyes, posting it online, sitting with it for a week or two. So putting some time into that relationship can sometimes reveal something about it as well. So that can be really important, especially if you're working like I am here, working flat, mostly flat. It's kind of at a slight angle. I have a particular relationship that's oriented at this angle. Seeing it in front of me, I'm capturing the overhead camera. That gives me a slightly different view on the proportions and perspective. It's changing my relationship to the artwork. So that's really important. Thank you for bringing that up. I think the small thumbnails is a huge way to go because it reduces the detail. It really shows you what's fundamental. And one of the things that I do in the field when I'm working on plein air is I'll be working on location, and then I'll go as far away from the drawing as I can, or the painting as I can, and I'll walk up to it slowly. And as I'm doing that, I'm trying to understand what changes. How am I seeing the work differently? Because when you're up close, you're taking in different information, and we're calibrating to that distance. As you step back, you're recalibrating it, and my goal is generally to make it work at any distance. But what works at a distance might be different than when it's up close. So in my paintings, I hope that you're engaged by the brushwork and the tactile quality of the paint. At about a mid-distance, hopefully it all comes together and you see it as a three-dimensional form with light, color, and shadow. And then as you step back even farther, hopefully it forms that even more, that it feels like a cohesive image that makes you want to come up to it, right? So I'm kind of being pulled into it. So hopefully that makes sense. Right here in the light side, there's just some subtle marks. And so as I focus on shape and direction, I'm just keeping the marks really light. I'm kind of just, again, the lift off, take off of these marks. And I'm not drawing that line, I'm sneaking up on that edge. And I'm trying to find that point at which my imagination takes over and fills in that missing information. Our brains are, we don't like not knowing. It's really uncomfortable for our brains to not know something. So we're really good at filling in information even if it's not there, right? So we have so many biases that are created just because of the pain that is caused in our brain about the unknown. So there, I'm feeling like, as I look at that, all right, now I can see that edge. If it's a little heavy, I can try lifting with my finger and pulling up a little bit. If it's too much, I can press with a kneaded eraser, and you can control the contrast that way. The other thing I can do as well is I can play around with the value in the background leading up to that edge. So I can kind of darken leading up to it. And if you transition out enough, then it doesn't become super obvious that I'm darkening in this one area. But then I can use the eraser to enhance that highlight right in here, kind of pull out more of that if I need to create a little bit more form. And lift more light there. And I can just see how it's feeling. I'm gonna let that sit a little bit. That's the hardest part, and it's counterintuitive, is to believe that, you know, the more we look at something, the less accurate we are in our observations. You know, I would rather make 100 quick observations of this ear, like say, you know, 100 1-second observations, rather than look at it for 100 seconds. Looking at it for 100 seconds it's ultimately going to distort it. And the test that I give to people to kind of challenge that is to see what happens if you look in the mirror and you just focus on your nose. It's going to feel like it's actually going to grow or shrink. It's changing size all the time because, again, our brains are designed to always have information changing. Nothing is really ever static. All right, so I'm going to set that pencil aside. I'm going to bring out my slightly darker one. Now, one of the things that you can also look at as we're trying to create form with our marks is, again, if we look at those edges, how do we vary those edges? If I look here at this edge, for example, there's kind of this dark line here. There's this darker edge that projects in front of this back edge. So I'm not using my darkest marks along the contour. I'm trying to observe where the darker marks might be inside the form, and then slightly lighter marks leading up to that edge. Now in here, we have these kind of soft fur hairs in here. So what this is as a mark is I'm pushing into that lighter area with the darker charcoal and kind of lifting up. Again, just trying to be aware of that direction. And I'm going to then keep it on the, I'm going to keep it slanted like this, using the side of the pencil, and kind of soften that, you know, kind of feather that out. And then where this shadow line is right now, it's not quite as hard as I would like it to be, because it is such a defined thing. But I want to be careful not to create a line. But I do want to sharpen that edge. So just being really delicate along that edge to try to sharpen that. All right, Beth, you're a graphic designer for 35 years. I'm happy to be retired and not have to make art by committee anymore. I have a tremendous respect for graphic designers, commercial artists. What a hard job. So here, as I'm looking at this form on this ossicone, I think that's right, I'm looking at the edges, and then I'm seeing, like right in here, the line of termination, we have a kind of it gets a little bit darker here than it is up along that edge, and that is what's going to help create a sense of form and volume. And I'm looking over at this ossicone here. This shadow is a little bit darker than like right in here. So I'm going to kind of enhance the values along this side here. And I'm just rolling the pencil, kind of focusing on the direction of the marks. I have to contort myself to get some of these. I'm going to drop in some shadow on this side to create a light side, shadow side. How are we doing on time? 2:45. Nice. All right. I'm going to refine this edge here. We see another kind of fold in that ear. And it gets darker in the tip of the ear. Oh, then I'm seeing this very subtle light catching on the edge. So I'm going to take the eraser and try to refine it just a little bit. And if you overstate that reflection, that's okay. Or not reflection, but the highlight. So I'm kind of overstating it there. It's a little bit too big. You can come back into it with your charcoal. And rather than a line, I'm going to make it I'm going to observe the path, but create that edge with these short kind of hatch marks. And that helps to give it a little bit more volume. So now we have this ear. We've got the fur coming out of the ear. So I'm going to do some negative drawing, kind of lifting and pulling into that area. When it gets really dark right in here. And I like the smooth quality of that ear, so I'll bring out the blending stump for the first time. Smooth that out. And I should do that over on this side too. Create a little bit of contrast in that texture. And then right along this ear, I love that edge, but I'm going to be, instead of drawing one strong line, I'm just kind of lifting and kind of letting it skip across that edge. Bonnie's saying I'm definitely pronouncing the ossicones correct. Awesome. You said 3 times in a sentence, and that's mine. That's right. Sickening. I'm gonna call it that and see if we can change the word, come up with our own term. So one thing that kind of comes to mind is, we can really take this drawing to another level by really creating that horizontal plane along the top of the head. We see very little of it because we're kind of right at eye level with it. So if we can observe how it kind of wraps up and around and then levels out and then it goes back to those ossicones. So what's it going to take to do that? It's going to take variation. Whenever you see a change in value, direction of the mark, or shape, that's going to help to create depth. It's going to create division. Right now, I don't have enough of that, so I basically have like one shape and then another shape. So I can create a little bit more depth if this little dark spot here, where we're looking at across the top, I change that shape, change up the direction. And now as I come down here, I'm going to treat this section here as slightly different. So I'm going to change the direction here, change the direction here. And there's a little kind of dark mark along here. That breaks up that space, but I'm going to kind of sneak up on it. So hopefully that makes sense. And that's, again, where I'm hoping to really take that to, again, another level by observing that one area. So you might think about that in relation to, say, a portrait, where you might want to push the ears back, and you really have to create all the information in that very narrow space of that depth between the cheekbone and the ear. And again, it's about taking all that information and trying to divide it up, but you got to do it in such a way that it doesn't really jump off the paper. It's about being subtle, and you try to, I've been using that term a lot today, is sneak up on it. Kind of be gentle with it, and then bring it into greater prominence slowly. Okay. So a little bit more variation in the eyes, I think, will help to bring them to life a little bit. So if I notice the eyelashes are actually darker than the eyeball, and there's some subtle reflection. There's a little bit of dark depth in there. Okay. Let's see, I want to get these kind of random, long, bristly lip hairs. Okay, so now, again, we're, in this preparatory drawing, I'm not quite as happy with this transition here. I don't have that depth that we were just talking about along the top of the head. So I want to work that a little bit more, and I may kind of let this kind of trail off a little bit. I don't know if I really need to finish this area down here quite as much. I kind of like the atmosphere that's kind of created in this. All right, thank you, Pat. I appreciate it. Let's see. Beth is asking if my finished drawing will be available online for us to study. I'll be sure to post it on Artist Network. So that same page, I pinned it at the top of the chat, and again, you'll find the link in the description below. I'll post it there if you want to see it there. So, all right. Okay. Just want to make sure I'm not missing any questions. How do I want to do this? So squinting again, trying to see where edges might disappear. I think I need a little bit more definition along this. We're catching some reflected light along this eye socket here, the lower eyelid there. But I want to make sure that when I squint at the drawing, it's not competing, because this is in shadow, right? So when I look at it in sharp focus, when I look at the reference in sharp focus, this really feels light. But if I put my awareness on some of these light areas here, you can see that this is actually darker than it. So I want to just be mindful of that in the relationship between these two, that this should be darker in value. And so what I'm going to do is actually going to drop this down a little bit more, put a slight wash on it, and then really bear down on the charcoal here to pop that edge by using that contrast a little bit more. Okay. And I feel like now the relationship here works out well. So if you're having trouble with that, on your drawing, fix your gaze here, but think about this value, put your awareness on this one, and then flip it. Focus on this part of your drawing and think about what's happening here. And I think I need a little bit more structure. Going to divide this side of the head up a little bit more. These marks on the head are really wild. Let's see. All right, I think that kind of works. I'm gonna see if I can lift more light off of here. Really push that contrast and break up that shape, because that was too intense. Actually, there's some cool light catching on those eyelashes. It's a little bit too much. Okay, so now I need to figure out this transition here. And I think probably what I did is I overdefined this section of the neck. So I'm going to keep it loose. And yeah, I'm just going to keep it loose and then see how I might be able to kind of finish that off a little bit. So I'm just going to rough in these shapes here. These cool dark spots that the giraffe is known for. So I'm just using the side of the pencil and roughing in that shape. I'm not being very precise, but I do want to, let's see, I'm going to block in the mane here. But I do have to go pretty soon, I think. We've been on for a couple hours, so I will kind of wrap this up quickly with just some quick kind of finishing marks in here. So with the mane, again, I'm using the side of the charcoal pencil. It creates a really nice fine line, and I'm thinking more about direction and flow. And after each mark, I'm rotating the pencil just slightly. So it all happens very quickly. And it's this scooping motion that helps me to control the pressure. So it creates this gentle kind of lift off. And then these spots, again, it's similar to the other features here where I don't want to overstate them. They're all in shadow, so I want to make sure that it stays in shadow. And I'm just going to kind of sketch those in here. And then, I feel like that is probably a stronger approach than what I had in my preparatory drawing. I can define this edge of the giraffe through the light and shadow here rather than a dark line. So kind of we spend so much time in here and I just kind of wipe through there, and sometimes that's all you really need. But I think I do want to kind of suggest some light on here without getting too kind of involved with it. Just some kind of quick sketches. Hopefully that kind of gives you some strategies, though, to complete your own drawing. Actually, you know what I'll do? Let me try this. It's a little bit smoother in this stretch of the neck. So if I do a subtle shift in texture contrast, that might be helpful as well. And then I can try to bring this edge forward a little bit more. And I feel like that helps. It helps to create that depth. So I'm deviating from the reference just slightly, but the goal is to create a sense of depth and understanding of the structure. All right, everybody. All right, well, Mariana, I hope I get to see your work. It sounds like it was a challenge. I hope so. I hope that you learned something from it here. I can switch back to this. So I'll try to share this on Artist Network. The next day or two, I'll get it posted. So be sure to like, subscribe, do all those things. We meet every Wednesday, 3 p.m. Eastern. Next week, we're going to be working on a master copy of Degas. I'm super excited about that. I believe it's one of his earlier ones, so we can really see that influence from Ingres, which I think would be really cool. So we'll work on edges, shading techniques, how to really create form, because I think Degas is the best. So I'm super excited about it. Thank you all for joining me. We'll switch back here. Again, thank you all for joining me. We will be back next week. If you have any additional questions, you can post it under the video. It goes up as a recording after this, and the chat will appear at some point later as well. It takes a little while to process, but love to see your work. Any other comments you might have, put it underneath that video. Tell all your friends, join us, and I can't wait to see you next week. Have a great weekend.